Alexander Thompson gazed at the city of New York through the window of his office on the top floor of the building that bore his surname. The orange hues of the late afternoon sky contrasted with the shadows of the skyscrapers stretching across the horizon. His cold eyes scanned the urban landscape as if evaluating another property for acquisition, but his mind was elsewhere. "Mr. Thompson," his secretary's voice came through the intercom, "Mr. Miller has arrived for the meeting." Alexander adjusted his grey Italian silk tie, an automatic gesture that reflected his constant need for control. "Send him in." Richard Miller, the Thompson family lawyer for over 3 decades, entered the room carrying a brown leather briefcase. His usually calm face bore a serious expression that Alexander couldn't immediately decipher. "Alexander, I'm afraid we have a delicate matter to discuss," Richard said, placing the briefcase on the solid mahogany desk. "It's about your father's will." The young businessman maintained his impassive expression, but his fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his leather chair. "I thought that matter was already settled." "Not everything." Richard cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "There's a clause your father kept secret until now, a condition for you to definitively take control of the Thompson empire." Alexander raised an eyebrow, his only visible sign of interest. "And what would that condition be?" "You need to get married within a year." The silence that followed was as thick as fog. Alexander slowly stood up, walking back to the window. His reflection in the glass showed a 35-year-old man with striking features inherited from his Italian lineage, meticulously trimmed black hair, and a custom-tailored suit worth more than many cars. "This is ridiculous." His voice came out controlled but with a sharp edge. "My father was never a sentimental man. Why this demand now?" Richard flipped through some documents. "The clause specifies that you must be married and maintain the marriage for at least 2 years to take full control. Otherwise, the board will temporarily assume control until the condition is met." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The last thing he needed was a marriage interfering with his plans. Relationships were complicated, unpredictable, and he hated not having complete control over situations. "How much time do I have to resolve this?" "The deadline starts counting from today, 12 months. Alexander returned to his desk, his mind already calculating possibilities. "Any specifications about who the bride should be?" "Only that it must be a legal and recognized marriage. Your father was very specific about the need to appear legitimate in the eyes of society." A cold smile formed on Alexander's lips. If his father wanted a marriage, he would have a marriage, but it would be on his terms. "Richard, I need you to prepare a special contract, a very specific prenuptial agreement." The lawyer nodded, already imagining the kind of document Alexander had in mind. "And the bride?" "Leave that to me." Alexander picked up his phone, dialing a number. "Charles, I need your services. I want a complete list of potential candidates. The profile is as follows: precarious financial situation, no scandals, good education, and most importantly, someone who understands that business is business." After hanging up, Alexander turned his attention to the city stretching out below. The sun had already set, and the lights were beginning to dot the urban landscape. Somewhere down there was the person who, unknowingly, would soon become part of his plan. In the following weeks, Alexander immersed himself in his usual routine of meetings and negotiations, delegating the search for a suitable bride to his team of investigators. Reports began to arrive, profile after profile of women who might fit his requirements. It was on a particularly hectic afternoon that the name Claire Johnson reached him, a literature teacher at a traditional private school, 28 years old, orphaned from both parents, struggling to maintain the house where she grew up and care for her younger sister who was still studying. The report indicated a considerable bank debt inherited from expensive medical treatments. "Perfect," murmured Alexander, analyzing the photo attached to the document. Claire had a classic beauty, delicate features, and expressive eyes that seemed to pierce through the paper. More important than her appearance, however, was her precarious financial situation. Desperate people rarely made demands. "Schedule a meeting," he ordered his assistant. "But not here. Choose a discreet restaurant. The Jazz Lounge, an elegant establishment in the heart of the Upper East Side, was chosen for the first meeting. Alexander arrived deliberately 10 minutes late, a tactic he always used to establish dominance in negotiations. Claire was already waiting for him, seated at a table at the back of the restaurant. She wore a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, likely her best outfit. Her brown hair was tied up in a discreet bun, and she nervously fiddled with the napkin on the table. "Miss Johnson." Alexander approached, his deep voice catching Claire's attention as she quickly stood up. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. Mr. Thompson." She extended her hand, which he briefly shook. Her grip was firm, decisive, something he hadn't expected. They sat down, and Alexander noticed that Claire was watching him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She must certainly have been wondering why one of the richest men in the country had requested her presence. "I imagine you're wondering the reason for this meeting," he began as direct as ever. "I have a proposal for you, one that could solve your current financial troubles." Claire tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "What kind of proposal?" "Marriage." The word came out cold, calculated. "A marital arrangement that would benefit us both." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of the piano in the background. Claire stared at him as if trying to determine if this was some kind of elaborate joke. "Why me?" Her voice was controlled, but Alexander noticed the underlying tension. "Because you need money and I need a wife." He gestured for the waiter to bring the wine he had ordered earlier. "It would be a purely business arrangement. You would maintain your normal life, your job, just living in my home and appearing at social events when necessary. In return, all your debts would be paid off, and you would receive a considerable monthly sum." Claire didn't respond immediately. Her eyes scanned the luxurious restaurant as if searching for an emergency exit. When she looked back at him, there was something different in her gaze. "Do you really think you can buy anything, even a marriage?" The question caught him off guard, not because of its content, but because of how directly it was delivered. Alexander leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "I'm not trying to buy you, Miss Johnson. I'm offering a practical solution to our respective problems. You keep your home, secure your sister's future, and I fulfill a family obligation. Simple as that." Claire took a deep breath, her fingers playing with the rim of the wine glass that had just been served. "And how long would this arrangement last?" 2 years, minimum. After that, a discreet and amicable divorce. You would walk away with a considerable financial compensation. Silence hung between them again, filled only by the soft piano music. Alexander watched every micro-expression on Claire's face, trying to anticipate her response. To his surprise, she seemed more thoughtful than scared or offended. "I need time to think," she finally said, her voice steady despite the surreal situation. Alexander nodded, pulling a card from his jacket. "You have 48 hours. All the details will be formalized in a contract, including your guarantees. Think carefully, Miss Johnson. Opportunities like this don't come around twice." He stood up, leaving the card on the table along with some bills that would generously cover the check. Before walking away, however, Claire called out to him, "Mr. Thompson." He turned, meeting her determined gaze. "Aren't you afraid that something might go wrong? That real feelings could complicate your perfect plan?" A cold smile curved Alexander's lips. "Miss Johnson, I learned long ago that feelings are for the weak. In real life, only business matters." With those words, he left, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts and a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. Claire opened the door to her modest apartment in Brooklyn with trembling hands. Alexander Thompson's card weighed in her purse as if it were made of lead. She leaned against the closed door, letting out a long, deep sigh. The conversation at the Jazz Lounge felt unreal, as if it had happened in another dimension. "Claire, is that you?" Her sister Marissa's voice came from the small room they shared. Soon the 19-year-old appeared in the hallway, her eyes shining with curiosity. "How did the interview go? Why was it at such a fancy restaurant?" Claire walked into the small living room, sinking into the worn-out sofa they had inherited from their parents. How could she explain to Marissa that it wasn't a job interview? How could she say that the most powerful man in New York had proposed? A marriage of convenience. "Marissa, sit here." Claire patted the space beside her. "I need to tell you something." As she recounted the events of the evening, Claire watched her sister's expressions shift from surprise to disbelief, and finally, to a kind of cautious hope. Marissa had always been the more practical of the two, while Claire tended to be swayed by romantic ideals, a legacy of reading too much classic literature. "Claire, you have to accept." Marissa gripped her hands tightly. "It's the solution to all our problems. The hospital debts, the mortgage on the house. It's not that simple, Marissa." Claire stood up, walking over to the window that looked out onto the quiet street. "We'd be living a lie, a fake marriage based on interest. And what's the alternative?" Marissa's voice grew serious. "Continue sinking into debt? Lose the house where we grew up? Claire, you've already sacrificed so much for me, for the memory of our parents. Maybe this is fate giving you a chance." Claire closed her eyes, remembering the cold gaze of Alexander Thompson. There was something about him that intrigued and frightened her at the same time, a loneliness well disguised behind the mask of power and control. The next morning, Claire tried to maintain her normal routine at the school where she taught, but her thoughts kept returning to Alexander's proposal. During her lesson on Pride and Prejudice, she couldn't help but see ironic parallels between her situation and the marriages of convenience in Jane Austen's time. "Ms. Johnson?" A student's voice brought her back to reality. "Are you okay? You seem distant today." "I'm fine, Alice," Claire forced a smile, "just thinking about how some literary themes remain relevant even after centuries." During the break, Claire took refuge in the school library. The smell of books always calmed her, reminding her of her father and the afternoons they spent reading together. What advice would he give now? Her mother always said that true love was the only solid foundation for a marriage, but she was also practical when necessary. Claire picked up her phone, looking once more at the number on Alexander's card. Her mind went back to the pile of bills at home, to Marissa's dream of going to medical school, to the night she cried in secret thinking about how to keep everything running. With trembling fingers, she typed a message. "Mr. Thompson, can we talk again? I have some questions about your proposal." The reply came almost instantly. "My office, 6 p.m. Don't be late." The Thompson Enterprises building was intimidating. Claire felt tiny as she rode the private elevator to the penthouse. Alexander's secretary, an elegant middle-aged woman, immediately led her to his office. Alexander was standing by the window, just like the first time she saw him at the restaurant. He turned to face her, his expression a mask of professional indifference. "Miss Johnson, I presume you've made a decision." "Not yet." Claire straightened her posture, determined not to be intimidated. "I have conditions." A shadow of surprise crossed Alexander's face, quickly replaced by a half-smirk. "Conditions? Interesting. Go on." "First, I want written guarantees about my sister's educational future. Second, my parents' house remains in my name, with no possibility of sale or alteration. Third, I keep my job as a teacher." Alexander approached, his steps slow and measured. "Is that all?" "No." Claire took a deep breath. "I want you to treat me with respect. I'm not a commodity you're buying. I'm a person entering into a business agreement. If we're going to do this, we'll do it right." The silence that followed was tense. Alexander studied her as if completely re-evaluating his initial assessment. "Your conditions are acceptable." He sat behind his imposing desk. "But I have mine as well. First, absolute discretion about the nature of our agreement. Second, you will attend social events when I request. Third, you will live in my house in separate rooms, obviously. And fourth, no external relationships during the term of the contract." Claire nodded slowly. "And after the 2 years?" "Each goes their own way, with the agreed financial guarantees." Alexander opened a drawer, pulling out a folder. "My lawyers have already prepared the contract. You can take it for review, but I need your answer within 24 hours. Claire took the folder, its weight seeming to carry the fate of her life and her family. "Have you done this before?" Using money to get what you want? Alexander looked up from the documents he was signing. Miss Johnson, money is just a tool. Like any tool, its effectiveness depends on who wields it. And feelings, are they just tools for you too? Feelings are unnecessary complications. That's why this is a business agreement, nothing more. Claire stood up, holding the folder against her chest. Then why do I feel like we're playing with fire, Mr. Thompson? For the first time, Claire saw something different flicker in Alexander's eyes, something that seemed almost vulnerable. But it was so quick she might have imagined it. The decision is yours, Miss Johnson, but remember, offers like this don't come twice in a lifetime. Claire left the office with her mind in a whirlwind. In the elevator, she opened the folder and began reading the contract. It was detailed, cold, calculated, exactly like the man who proposed it. But it also offered security, stability, and a future for Marissa. At home, she spent the night reading and rereading every clause. Marissa watched her anxiously, but respected her space. By the next morning, Claire had made her decision. She picked up her phone and typed a simple message. I accept your terms. Where should I sign? The reply came quickly. My office, 10 a.m., I'll bring the judge. Claire looked at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman who had just agreed to a marriage of convenience. Her eyes reflected determination, but also apprehension. Deep down, a voice whispered that this arrangement might be more complicated than either of them imagined. As she got ready to leave, Claire couldn't help but think of all the stories she had read about arranged marriages. In how many of them did the heart end up having the final say? She shook her head, pushing those thoughts away. This wasn't a romance, it was a business deal, and she needed to keep that in mind no matter what happened. The wedding ceremony was brief and formal, held in Alexander's office with only the necessary witnesses. Claire wore a simple white dress, hastily bought from a local store. Alexander maintained his usual impassive expression, dressed in an impeccable Italian suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. The judge, a gray-haired man who seemed bored with the procedure, conducted the ceremony with bureaucratic efficiency. When it came time to exchange rings, Claire felt an involuntary shiver at the cold touch of Alexander's fingers. The platinum rings chosen by him felt like they weighed a ton. You are now officially married, declared the judge, closing his record book. Congratulations. Alexander signed the final necessary documents while Claire stared at the ring on her finger, a symbol of an empty commitment that ironically represented her financial salvation. The car is waiting, Alexander announced, tucking his Mont Blanc pen into his jacket pocket. Shall we? Claire nodded, following him to the private elevator. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken words and unshared expectations. In the parking lot, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom awaited them, with a uniformed driver holding the door. Where are we going? Claire asked, settling into the soft leather seat. Home, Alexander replied curtly. Your move has already been arranged. Your personal belongings have been transferred to your room. Claire felt a tightness in her chest. You had someone go into my apartment. I hired a high-end moving company. Everything was done with the utmost professionalism and discretion, he said, glancing at her sideways. Your sister is already settled in as well, in her own room. The car glided silently through the streets of New York, leaving the financial district behind and heading toward the Upper East Side. Claire watched the city pass by the window, trying to process how her life had changed so drastically in less than a week. The Thompson mansion was exactly as Claire had imagined, an imposing neoclassical structure with meticulously maintained gardens and a security system fit for a head of state. The main gate opened automatically as the car approached, revealing a driveway lined with imperial palm trees. Welcome to your new home, Alexander said, his voice devoid of emotion. Margaret, the housekeeper, will show you around. I have an important meeting in an hour. Before Claire could respond, a middle-aged woman dressed in a discreet yet elegant uniform appeared at the front door. Mrs. Thompson, Margaret greeted with a professional smile. Please, follow me. Claire followed the housekeeper through the interior of the mansion, trying not to show her astonishment at the luxury surrounding her. Every room looked like it had been plucked from a decor magazine, with designer furniture, original artwork, and an atmosphere of old-world wealth that made Claire feel even more out of place. "This is your room," Margaret announced, opening a double door on the second floor. "Mr. Thompson requested it be prepared according to your preferences." The room was larger than her entire old apartment. A king-sized bed dominated the space, covered in Egyptian cotton sheets. The pearl-toned walls displayed delicate paintings, and one wall was entirely occupied by an empty bookshelf, waiting to be filled. "Your sister is in the room next door," Margaret continued. "Mr. Thompson's room is in the other wing of the house. He values his privacy very much." Claire walked over to the French window that led to a small private balcony. From there she could see the backyard gardens with an infinity pool and an elegant gazebo. "Dinner is served at 8 p.m., Margaret informed her. "Mr. Thompson rarely dines at home, but when he is present he expects punctuality." After the housekeeper left, Claire finally allowed her legs to tremble. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the soft fabric of the bedspread. Everything felt too surreal. The door suddenly opened, and Marissa rushed in, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Claire, have you seen this? It's like a palace. My room has an amazing view and—" She stopped when she saw the expression on her sister's face. "Hey, are you okay?" Claire forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mari, just adjusting." Marissa sat down beside her, holding her hand. "You did this for us, didn't you?" She sacrificed herself again. "It's not a sacrifice," Claire tried to sound convincing. "It's an agreement that benefits everyone. You'll be able to study medicine, our debts are paid." "But what about love?" Marissa interrupted her. "You always talked about finding true love, like in the books you read." Claire stood up, walking over to the empty bookshelf. "Sometimes life doesn't follow the script we imagine. Besides, it's temporary. 2 years will pass quickly." The sound of footsteps in the hallway silenced them. Alexander passed by the open door, pausing briefly. "Dinner will be served in 10 minutes. I expect both of you in the main dining room." The first dinner as a family was a surreal experience. The dining table, which could easily seat 20 people, seemed even more grandiose with only 3 occupants. Alexander sat at the head, Claire to his right and Marissa to his left. "Tomorrow there will be a charity event at the club," Alexander announced between precise bites of his salad. "It will be your first public appearance as Mrs. Thompson. Margaret has already arranged a suitable dress." Claire put down her fork. "So soon? I thought we'd have some time to—" "Time is a luxury we don't have," Alexander interrupted her. "Society expects to see the new Mrs. Thompson. We need to establish our story quickly." "And what is our story?" Claire challenged him. "How did we meet? How did we fall in love, or are we just going to smile and wave?" A tense silence fell over the table. Marissa looked from one to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "We met through mutual friends," Alexander finally replied. "A discreet romance that I preferred to keep out of the spotlight. Simple, plausible, and hard to dispute." Claire laughed humorlessly. "And what about love? How do we explain that?" For the first time, something resembling irritation crossed Alexander's face. "Love is irrelevant in this equation, Mrs. Thompson. What matters is the appearance of marital happiness." "Of course," Claire murmured, "because appearances are everything in this world, aren't they?" Alexander studied her for a moment, his dark eyes inscrutable. "You still don't understand who you're dealing with, Claire. This isn't one of your romance novels where love conquers all. This is the real world, where power and influence are the only currencies that matter." Marissa cleared her throat, standing abruptly. "I think I'll go. To my room, I need to organize a few things." After she left, Claire and Alexander remained silent, the sound of cutlery against fine porcelain echoing through the room. "Why are you like this?" Claire finally asked. "So cold, so distant from any emotion." "Because emotions are weaknesses I can't afford to have," he replied, standing up. "Sleep well, Mrs. Thompson. Tomorrow will be a long day." Claire watched him leave the room, his posture as rigid and controlled as ever. But for a brief moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes, a shadow of loneliness so deep that it made her heart ache, even against her will. Later, in her room, Claire opened her suitcase and pulled out a worn book, her old copy of Pride and Prejudice. She smiled ironically, thinking about how her life had turned into a modern, twisted version of a Jane Austen novel. But unlike Elizabeth Bennet, she wasn't sure if there was a heart waiting to be discovered beneath the cold mask of her own Mr. Darcy. The dress chosen by Margaret was a midnight blue silk creation that flowed like water over Claire's body. Standing in front of the mirror in her closet, she barely recognized herself. The makeup artist and hairstylist hired by Alexander had worked for hours to transform her into the dignified Mrs. Thompson that society expected to see. "You're late," Alexander's voice came from the bedroom door. He was impeccable in his tuxedo, as always. "The car is waiting." Claire turned to face him, noticing a brief flicker of something indefinable in his eyes before his usual mask of indifference returned. "I'm sorry, I'm still not used to all this and process. You'll have to get used to it quickly." Alexander approached, holding out a blue velvet box. "This completes your look." Inside the box was a set of sapphires and diamonds that made Claire gasp. "Alexander, this is necessary," he finished, taking out the necklace and standing behind her. His fingers brushed lightly against the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp, sending an involuntary shiver through her. Appearances are everything in this world. The Manhattan Club was magnificently decorated for the annual charity event of the Thompson Foundation. Golden lights illuminated the gardens, and a chamber orchestra played soft music as the elite of New York circulated with their champagne glasses. "Remember," Alexander murmured as they ascended the main staircase, his arm firmly linked with hers. "You are now Claire Thompson, act like it." Claire barely had time to respond before they were surrounded by a group of people eager to meet the new Mrs. Thompson. Among them was William Carter, a tall and elegant man whom Claire recognized from business magazines. "Alexander, my old friend," William approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So the rumors were true. You finally found someone who melted your icy heart." Claire felt Alexander tense beside her, but his social smile remained unshaken. "William, I didn't know you'd be here tonight. Oh, I wouldn't miss the chance to meet the woman who achieved the impossible." William turned to Claire, taking her hand and placing a kiss that lingered too long. "Mrs. Thompson, you are even more charming than they say." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Carter," Claire replied diplomatically, gently removing her hand. There was something in his gaze that made her uncomfortable. "Please, call me William. After all, we're practically family. Alexander and I grew up together, didn't we, old friend?" Alexander smiled coldly. "Times have changed, William. If you'll excuse us, I need to introduce my wife to some board members." As they walked away, Claire noticed that Alexander's hand on her back was firmer than necessary. "Is there a history between you two that I should know about?" "William Carter is an opportunist," Alexander replied quietly. "He waits for any sign of weakness to strike. That's why it's crucial that our presentation tonight is impeccable." The evening continued like a carefully choreographed dance. Claire was introduced to dozens of important people, all curious to meet the woman who had won the most eligible bachelor in New York. To her own surprise, she found herself navigating the social conversations well. Years of classroom experience giving her the ability to adapt to different audiences. It was during a brief pause, while Alexander spoke with some investors, that William Carter reappeared at her side. "A literature teacher," he commented, offering her a glass of champagne. "How fascinating. You know, I always wondered what would make Alexander finally marry. The will clause must have been motivating." Claire felt her blood run cold. I beg your pardon." William smiled, a predatory smile that made her want to step back. "Oh, don't worry, darling. Your secrets are safe with me. But if you ever need a friend, know that you can count on me." "Mrs. Thompson," Lorenzo's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "It's time for our dance." Claire had never been so relieved to see her facade of a husband. Lorenzo led her to the dance floor, where other couples were already waltzing to the sound of the orchestra. "What did William say to you?" he asked as he guided her precisely through the steps of the waltz. "He knows," Claire whispered, close to Lorenzo's ear. About the will, about our arrangement. For a moment, Lorenzo's mask faltered, and Claire caught a glimpse of something close to panic in his eyes. But it was only for an instant. "Stay away from him," Lorenzo instructed, his voice low and intense. "William is more dangerous than you think." "Why? What can he do?" "He can destroy everything." Lorenzo pulled her closer under the pretense of the dance. "The Thompson Empire, your financial security, your sister's future, everything." A shiver ran down Claire's spine. The soft music and golden lights now seemed like a fragile facade, hiding deeper, more dangerous currents. "How long have you known each other?" she asked, trying to better understand the dynamic between the two men. Lorenzo hesitated for a moment. "We grew up together. Our fathers were partners until..." "Until what?" "Until he tried to take control of the company during a moment of weakness for my father. That's why I learned to never trust anyone, to never let my guard down." Claire studied him as they danced. For the first time, she saw beyond the cold, calculating businessman's facade. There was pain there, old scars that had never properly healed. "Not even your wife?" she asked softly. Lorenzo looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "Especially in my wife of convenience." The music ended, but they remained on the dance floor for a moment, locked in a silent standoff. Claire realized that, despite all the theatrics they were enacting, there were truths too painful to ignore. "I'll get something to drink," she finally said, stepping away. She needed a moment alone to process everything that was happening. On the club's terrace, Claire breathed in the cool night air, trying to gather her thoughts. The weight of the sapphires around her neck seemed to symbolize the weight of expectations and secrets she now carried. "An interesting night, isn't it?" William's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Mr. Carter, please..." "William," he corrected, stepping closer. "You know, Claire, may I call you Claire? You intrigue me. What does a smart woman like you really gain from this arrangement?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Claire replied, maintaining her composure. "If you'll excuse me..." William gently blocked her path. "Alexander has always been good at making deals, but sometimes his deals have unexpected consequences. It would be a shame if the press found out about the true nature of your marriage." "Are you threatening me?" "On the contrary, darling. I'm offering an alternative. Alexander isn't the only one who can provide financial security. And unlike him, I know how to appreciate a woman like you." Claire felt nausea rise in her throat. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the air like steel. "Take your hands off my wife." Alexander stood at the terrace door, his eyes burning with a contained fury Claire had never seen before. William stepped back with a calculated smile. "Just a friendly conversation, Alexander. Your wife is delightful company." "The party is over for us," Alexander declared, extending his hand to Claire. "Let's go home." In the car, the silence was deafening. Claire watched Alexander's tense profile, realizing there was much more at stake than a simple marriage arrangement. "He's going to cause trouble, isn't he?" she finally asked. "William always causes trouble," Alexander replied, his voice laden with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "That's why we need to be more careful than ever." "What aren't you telling me, Alexander?" He turned to face her, and for the first time Claire saw true vulnerability in his eyes. "There are things you're better off not knowing, Claire, for your own safety." That night, lying in her king-sized bed, Claire couldn't sleep. William's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the image of the contained fury in Alexander's eyes. Her marriage of convenience was turning out to be far more complicated than she had imagined. And something told her that the events of that night were just the beginning. The morning after the charity event, Claire woke up to the sound of raised voices coming from Alexander's office. She immediately recognized the deep tone of her husband, but there was something different in his voice, an urgency she had never noticed before. "I need you to find out everything," Alexander was ordering someone. "Every move he's made in the past few weeks, every person he's spoken to. William wouldn't make threats without a plan." Claire quietly approached the slightly open office door. Alexander was standing by the window, the phone pressed to his ear, his shoulders tense under his impeccable suit. "I don't care about the cost," he continued. "I want daily reports on his activities and tightened security at the mansion, especially around Claire." Hearing her name, Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. The concern in Alexander's voice seemed genuine, something she hadn't expected from their marriage of convenience. "Mr. Thompson," Margaret appeared in the hallway, causing Claire to quickly step away from the door. "Breakfast is served." In the dining room, Claire found Marissa already seated at the table, absorbed in her tablet. Her sister looked up, a knowing smile on her lips. "I saw the photos from last night's event on social media," Marissa commented, sliding the tablet over to Claire. "You two look like the perfect couple." Claire glanced at the images. Indeed, the photos showed her and Alexander dancing, talking, smiling at each other. To any outsider, they looked completely in love. "Appearances can be deceiving," Claire murmured, handing the tablet back. "Are they?" Marissa raised an eyebrow. "Because the way he was looking at you during the dance didn't seem fake to me." Before Claire could respond, Alexander entered the dining room. He looked more tired than usual, small lines of tension around his eyes betraying his composed appearance. "Good morning," he greeted formally, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Claire, we need to talk after breakfast in private." Breakfast passed in silence, interrupted only by the clinking of silverware against fine porcelain. Marissa soon excused herself, citing a prior engagement with friends, leaving Claire and Alexander alone. "In my office," he indicated, standing up. Claire followed him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. Alexander's office was a perfect reflection of his personality, organized, elegant, and intimidating. He closed the door behind them and gestured for Claire to sit in one of the leather armchairs. "We need to establish some ground rules after yesterday's incident," he began, his voice controlled. "William Carter is more dangerous than you realize." "Why?" Claire looked directly at him. "What does he really want?" Alexander hesitated, something rare for him. "William and I have a complicated history. Our fathers were partners in Thompson Enterprises, but there was a dispute, a situation that led to the Carter family leaving the company." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that leaves scars," Alexander replied vaguely. "William has never forgiven me for the role I played in all of that. He spent years building his own empire, but always with an eye on Thompson Enterprises." Claire processed the information slowly, "And now he sees our marriage as an opportunity." "Exactly." Alexander stood up, walking to the window. "If he can prove that our marriage is a sham, he can use that to question my ability to lead the company. The clause in the will would be invalidated, and control would temporarily pass to the board." "Where William has allies," Claire added, beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "Precisely," Alexander nodded. "That's why we need to be more careful than ever. No private conversations with him, no contact outside of necessary social events." Claire stood up as well, moving closer to Alexander. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because the less you knew, the safer you would be." He turned to face her, and Claire was surprised by the intensity in his eyes. "But now the circumstances have changed." "How so?" "William will try to get close to you again. He'll try to use his charm, make promises, maybe even veiled threats. I need you to be prepared." Claire felt a wave of indignation. "You think I would give in to his advances?" "No," Alexander replied immediately, his voice softer. "But I don't want you to get hurt in the process." The silence that followed was heavy with unresolved tension. Claire noticed how close they were, almost touching. For a moment she saw something different in Alexander's eyes, a vulnerability he usually kept well hidden. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "This is just a business arrangement, remember?" Alexander raised his hand as if to touch her face, but stopped halfway. "Things aren't always as simple as we plan, Claire." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Alexander's phone. He quickly stepped back, reassuming his professional demeanor. "Thompson," he answered, his voice returning to its usual cold tone. After a few moments of listening, his face hardened. "I understand. I'll be there in an hour." Hanging up the phone, he turned to Claire. "I need to go to the office. There's a situation that requires my immediate attention." "Something related to William?" Possibly. Alexander grabbed his briefcase from the table. Please don't leave the mansion today. It's safer this way. Claire watched him prepare to leave, noticing small details she had overlooked before. The way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight, the lines of worry on his forehead, the way his eyes kept returning to her, as if he wanted to say more. "Alexander," she called out as he was about to leave, "is there something else you're not telling me?" He stopped at the door, his hand hesitating on the knob. For a moment, Claire thought he might finally open up, reveal all the secrets that were clearly tormenting him. But then his professional mask slipped back into place. "Just stay safe," he replied, quickly exiting. Alone in the office, Claire walked over to the bookshelf that lined one of the walls. Among the volumes on law and business, she found something unexpected, an old photo in a simple frame. In it, two young men smiled in front of a yacht, Alexander and William, clearly close friends at the time. The contrast between that image and the current reality was shocking. What could have happened to turn that friendship into such deep antagonism? And why did Claire feel there was much more to this story than Alexander was willing to reveal? Her thoughts were interrupted by a message on her phone. It was from an unknown number, but the content made her blood run cold. "Dear Claire, I hope you slept well after our little chat yesterday. There's much more about your husband that you should know. How about coffee? I promise to be discreet." "William?" Claire stared at the message for a long time, her finger hovering over the block option, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was her natural curiosity, or perhaps it was the growing feeling that she was diving into much deeper and more dangerous waters than she had imagined. In her room later, Claire found a Cartier box on her bed. Inside was a delicate, white gold bracelet, along with a note in Alexander's elegant handwriting. "To match yesterday's necklace, wear it always, eh?" Only after putting on the bracelet did Claire notice something peculiar. There was a small, almost imperceptible device embedded in it. Alexander wasn't just giving her a piece of jewelry, he was giving her protection. The question was, protection? From what? Or from whom? In the library of the Thompson mansion, Claire ran her fingers over the spines of the old books, searching for something that could help her better understand the man she had married. The bracelet on her wrist gleamed under the soft light of the lamps, constantly reminding her of the complexity of her situation. William's message remained unanswered on her phone, a dangerous temptation she couldn't completely ignore. The more time she spent in that house, the more questions arose about Alexander's past and the events that had shaped him into the man he was today. "Mrs. Thompson," Margaret's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I found something that might interest you." The housekeeper carried an old box of photographs, apparently retrieved from some storage area in the mansion. Claire accepted the box with curiosity. "Thank you, Margaret. How long have you worked for the Thompson family?" "For over 25 years, the housekeeper replied, hesitating for a moment. "I watched young Alexander grow up, and I've seen many things change in this house." The tone in her voice caught Claire's attention. "What kind of changes?" Margaret adjusted her immaculate apron, a gesture Claire had already noticed was a sign of nervousness. "There was a time when this house was different, more alive. Mr. Alexander wasn't always the way he is now." "What happened?" "It's not my place to speak of it," Margaret replied diplomatically. "But perhaps the photographs can tell a story that words cannot." After the housekeeper left, Claire began to examine the contents of the box. The first photographs showed a teenage Alexander, smiling openly, an expression she had never seen on his face. In several images, he appeared alongside William Carter, the two clearly inseparable. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed the Thompson and Carter families gathered at an event, everyone smiling. Claire recognized Alexander's father by the resemblance, but her eyes were drawn to a strikingly beautiful young woman standing between Alexander and William. "Isabella," Lorenzo's voice startled her. He stood at the library door, his face a mask of restrained emotions as he saw the photograph in her hands. "Who was she?" Claire asked softly, noticing how Lorenzo's eyes couldn't look away from the image. Lorenzo stepped into the library, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, he simply stared at the photograph, as if deciding how much to reveal. Isabella was the daughter of one of the company's major shareholders, he began, his voice carrying a weight Claire had never heard before. She grew up with us, William and me. We were inseparable during our teenage years. Claire noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he touched the photograph. What happened to her? She left, Lorenzo replied curtly, but Claire sensed there was much more to the story. It was during the most turbulent period for the company. William and Hayes, we had different visions for how to run the business after my father fell ill. And Isabella was caught in the middle of it? She was at the center of it all. Lorenzo stepped away, walking toward the window. William and I both fell in love with her. At first, we tried to keep our friendship above it, but love complicated everything, Claire finished gently. Love is a weakness businessmen can't afford, Lorenzo replied automatically, but his voice faltered on the last word. What really happened, Lorenzo? He remained silent for so long that Claire thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with an old pain. Isabella chose William, or at least that's how it seemed. But then we discovered her family was involved in a scheme to take control of the company. William knew everything. He was helping them. Isabella, she had been part of the plan from the beginning. Claire felt her heart tighten as she saw the vulnerability on Lorenzo's face. How did you find out? I found documents, proof of their involvement. When I confronted William, he denied everything. Isabella stood by his side, even with the evidence. That's when I realized I had been manipulated. All along, what did you do? What needed to be done? I exposed the scheme to the board, presented the evidence. Isabella's family lost everything. William was forced out of the company, and Isabella... He hesitated. Isabella disappeared. No one knows for sure where she went. Claire processed the information slowly. Is that why William wants revenge? Because of Isabella? Because of everything. The money, the power, Isabella. He blames me for losing it all. Alexander turned to face her. And now he sees in you an opportunity to return the favor. What do you mean? He wants to do to me what he believes I did to him. Use someone I love to destroy me. The words hung in the air between them, laden with unintended meanings. Claire felt her heart race as she realized the implication of what Alexander had just said. But you don't love me, she said softly. This is just a business arrangement, remember? Alexander stared at her, something indefinable in his eyes. Things aren't always what they seem, Claire. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Claire's phone. It was another message from William. Time is ticking, dear Claire. There are things about that time that Alexander will never tell. From you. Things you need to know. Alexander noticed her expression change. William? Claire nodded, showing him the message. Alexander read it, his face hardening. Claire, promise me you won't meet with him. William is manipulative. He'll try to use your doubts against you, against us. Us? Claire raised an eyebrow. I thought there was no us, just a contract. Alexander took a step toward her, his hand lightly touching her face. The gesture, so unlike his usual coldness, made Claire hold her breath. Perhaps I was wrong about some things, he murmured. Before Claire could process what was happening, the moment was shattered by the urgent sound of the intercom. It was Richard Miller, the lawyer, with news that couldn't wait. I have to go, Alexander said, stepping away quickly. Please, Claire, be careful. William is more dangerous than you think. After he left, Claire turned her attention to the photographs. In all of them, Isabella smiled with a confidence that now seemed almost predatory, now that Claire knew the story. Was Alexander telling the whole truth, or was there more to that story than he was willing to reveal? The bracelet on her wrist glimmered again, reminding her of the layers of protection and distrust that now surrounded her life. Claire realized she was walking through a minefield of old secrets and broken loyalties, where nothing was exactly as it seemed. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with another message from William. Time is running out, Claire. Some truths can't stay buried forever. The meeting with Richard Miller had stretched into its third hour, when Alexander finally realized something was wrong. His phone, usually flooded with messages from Claire due to the preparations for the upcoming social event, remained silent. A growing unease settled in his chest, something he wasn't used to feeling. "Richard, we need to continue this tomorrow," he interrupted the lawyer mid-explanation about contract clauses. "Something isn't right." The lawyer looked at him with concern. "Alexander, you've been different these past few weeks, since the wedding." "This isn't the time for personal analysis," Alexander cut in, already grabbing his jacket. "Yet," something in Richard's expression made him pause. "What is it?" "You're starting to truly care for her, aren't you?" the lawyer asked softly. "Claire isn't Isabella. Maybe it's time to leave the past behind." Alexander froze at the mention of that name. "Don't mix things up. My marriage to Claire is a business arrangement, nothing more." "Then why are you so worried now?" Before Alexander could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his private investigator. "Mrs. Thompson seen entering Cafe Milano 20 minutes ago. William Carter arrived 5 minutes later." Alexander's blood ran cold. Cafe Milano was a discreet establishment in the Upper East Side, known for its privacy and exclusive clientele. It was exactly the kind of place William would choose for a private conversation. "I need to go," he murmured, already heading for the door. Richard grabbed his arm. "Alexander, before you do anything, remember Claire isn't your property. If she chose to meet with William, she had her reasons." "You don't understand," Alexander replied, his voice tense. "William is capable of anything to hurt me. He'll use Claire just like he used Isabella." On the way to the cafe, Alexander tried to control the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Why had Claire agreed to meet with William? What could he have said to convince her? The questions tormented him as his driver navigated through the traffic of New York. Inside Cafe Milano, Claire observed William Carter with a mix of caution and curiosity. He maintained a charming smile as he poured more coffee into her cup, his movements calculated to appear natural and friendly. "You know, Claire," William began, his voice smooth as velvet, "Alexander was always good at telling stories, especially the ones that make him seem like the wronged hero." "And you have a different version?" Claire asked, keeping her voice neutral. William leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "I have the truth. Have you ever wondered why Isabella really disappeared?" Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "Alexander said she left after the scheme was uncovered." "Alexander said—" William laughed humorlessly. "Claire, darling, you're too smart to accept just one side of the story. Isabella didn't just leave, she was forced to disappear." "What do you mean?" William leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Alexander found out about the supposed scheme and instead of confronting any of us directly, orchestrated an elaborate trap. He planted evidence, manipulated documents, all to make it seem like Isabella and I were the villains of the story." Claire felt her heart race. Why? Why would he do that? Because he couldn't stand the idea of losing, not the company, not Isabella. William pulled an envelope from his briefcase. "Here are the original documents, not the manipulated copies Alexander presented to the board. See for yourself." With trembling hands, Claire opened the envelope. The documents looked old, some yellowed with age. As she read, her eyes widened. With each new revelation, "This can't be true," she murmured, "but it is, and there's more." William hesitated as if weighing his next words. "Isabella was pregnant when she disappeared. And it wasn't my child she was expecting." Claire felt the air leave her lungs. "Are you saying that the child was Alexander's, but he was so blinded by power, so determined to maintain control of the company, that he didn't hesitate to destroy all the lives involved? Isabella realized too late the man he truly was." The sound of the cafe door swinging open abruptly interrupted the conversation. Alexander was standing there, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. Claire had never seen him so pale. "Step away from her, William," Alexander ordered, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "Too late, old friend?" William smiled, leaning back in his chair. "The truth has an interesting way of coming to light, doesn't it?" Claire stood up, the document still in her hands. "Alexander, what are these papers? Why did you never tell me about the baby?" Alexander's face twisted into an expression of pain that Claire had never seen before. Claire, don't believe a word he says. William is a master at manipulating the truth. Like you? She asked softly. The silence that followed was deafening. Other cafe patrons began to discreetly observe the scene, sensing the tension in the air. Let's go home, Alexander finally said, extending his hand to Claire. I can explain everything. Claire looked at the outstretched hand, then at the documents in her hands, and finally at William, who maintained a satisfied smile. The choice is yours, Claire, William said softly. But remember, some lies are too big to be forgiven. Claire felt the weight of the bracelet on her wrist, that gift that now seemed more like a golden leash. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. The truth always finds its way to the light, even through the densest shadows. I need time, she finally said, taking a step back from both men. I need to think. Claire, please. Alexander's voice was laden with an emotion she had never heard before. Don't do this. Do what, Alexander? Seek the truth or simply accept another one of your convenient versions of the story? With those words, Claire grabbed her bag and left the cafe, leaving behind two men who carried the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The fresh air of New York hit her face like a slap, bringing her back to the reality of her situation. Her phone began to ring. It was Marissa. Claire answered, grateful for the distraction. Claire, where are you? Something strange is happening. Here at the mansion. Margaret is acting weird and there are people I've never seen before going through the office files. Claire felt her heart skip a beat. Marissa, lock yourself in your room. Don't open the door for anyone. I'm on my way home now. As she called a cab, Claire realized she was at the center of a far more complex web than she had imagined. William's revelations, Alexander's reaction, the suspicious behavior at the mansion. It was all connected, somehow. And she needed to figure out how before it was too late. Claire passed through the gates of the Thompson mansion with her heart racing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the immaculate gardens, creating an almost surreal backdrop for the drama unfolding. Her mind was still processing William's revelations while her hands clutched the documents inside her bag. In the entrance hall, she found Margaret with a worried expression that didn't match her usual composure. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper whispered, quickly approaching. Thank goodness you're back. There are people from Mr. Thompson's office saying they're auditing old documents. Where's Marissa? In her room as you instructed, but there's something else. Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously around. I found something you need to see. Something about Isabella. The name made Claire shudder. Where? In the old room of Mrs. Thompson, Alexander's mother. No one has been in there for years, but with all the commotion today, I thought it wise to check. Margaret pulled an old key from her apron pocket. You need to see this for yourself. Claire followed the housekeeper to the third floor of the mansion, an area she rarely visited. The hallway was narrower, with vintage wallpaper and paintings covered by cloth. Margaret stopped in front of a solid wood double door. No one but me has access to this room, she explained, inserting the key into the lock. Mrs. Thompson, before she passed, made me promise to keep everything exactly as it was. The room that was revealed was like a time capsule, elegant furniture covered in white sheets, heavy curtains partially blocking the sunlight, and an old perfume still lingering in the air. Margaret walked straight to a mahogany desk, opening a secret drawer with a hidden mechanism. Mrs. Thompson left this, she said, handing Claire a leather-bound red journal. She said that one day someone would need to know the truth. With trembling hands, Claire opened the journal. Elegant handwriting filled page after page with revelations that made her heart tighten. The story that emerged was very different from both Alexander's and William's versions. Isabella wasn't pregnant when she left, Claire murmured, reading the pages. She was sick, very sick. Yes, Margaret confirmed softly. The leukemia was diagnosed just before everything happened. Only Mrs. Thompson knew. Claire continued reading, each page revealing more layers of a tragedy that had shaped so many lives. Isabella had discovered her illness and decided to distance herself from both Alexander and William, not wanting either of them to suffer because of her condition. The supposed scheme to take over the company never existed. They were documents related to selling shares to pay for her treatment abroad. Alexander never knew, Margaret explained, her hands nervously twisting her apron. Isabella made Mrs. Thompson promise not to tell. She didn't want anyone's pity, especially his. And William. Mr. Carter found out by chance. He came across medical documents. He tried to help Isabella in secret, but she had already decided to leave. That's when everything exploded, the misunderstandings, the accusations. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted the conversation. Alexander was standing at the door, his face a mask of shock as he saw Claire in his mother's room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Claire stood up, the diary still in her hands. "The truth, Alexander. We're finally uncovering the truth." He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the diary she held. "Where did you find that?" "Your mother left it with Margaret. She knew that one day we would need to know." Claire approached him, extending the diary. "Isabella was sick, Alexander. She didn't betray you. She didn't betray anyone. She was trying to save herself." Alexander took the diary with trembling hands, his eyes quickly scanning the pages. Claire watched as different emotions crossed his face. Shock, pain, understanding, and finally, deep devastation. "All these years," he murmured, sinking into a nearby armchair. "I built a fortress of anger and distrust based on a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Claire said gently, kneeling beside him. "It was a tragic misunderstanding. Isabella loved both of you too much to let you watch her suffer." William. Alexander looked up, realization dawning on his face. He knew. That's why all those hints, those taunts about the truth. He was trying to make you figure it out for yourself, Claire finished, in a twisted and manipulative way, but still. The sound of more footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Marissa appeared at the door, breathless. "Claire, Alexander, you need to see this. It just broke on all the online news outlets. William Carter is calling a press conference. He says he has revelations about the Thompson family." Alexander stood up abruptly, the diary still in his hands. "He's going to expose everything, use Isabella's story to destroy the company, my reputation." "No," Claire said firmly, holding his hand. "He's giving you the chance to do the right thing, to tell the truth yourself." For a long moment, Alexander just stared at her, as if truly seeing her for the first time. Then, slowly, a small smile began to form on his lips. Not his usual cold, calculated smile, but something genuine, almost vulnerable. "How do you do that, Claire?" "Do what?" "Make me want to be a better person. Make me believe that maybe, just maybe, not everything has to be about power and control." Claire felt her heart race under the intensity of his gaze. Because sometimes true power lies in admitting our mistakes and trying to make them right. Alexander nodded slowly, making a decision. "I need to talk to William, now, before the press conference." "I'm coming with you," Claire declared. It wasn't a question. "It's not safe." "Nothing in this story has been safe, Alexander. But we're in this together now. For real, not just because of a contract." Marissa cleared her throat from the doorway. I hate to interrupt this moment, but reporters are already gathering in front of the Thompson Enterprises building. The press conference is in an hour." Alexander looked at Claire, then at the diary in his hands, and finally at the portrait of his mother on the wall. It was time to bury the ghosts of the past and perhaps build a future based on something stronger than fear and mistrust. "Let's go," he said, extending his hand to Claire. "We have a story to tell." The sun was beginning to set as Alexander's car pulled up in front of the imposing Thompson Enterprises building. A small crowd of reporters had already gathered at the entrance, their cameras and microphones aimed like weapons, ready to capture every moment of the drama about to unfold. Claire watched Alexander's tense profile as he adjusted his tie, an automatic gesture she had already learned to recognize as a sign of nervousness. The diary of his mother rested on his lap, its pages containing truths that could change everything. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, placing her hand on his. Alexander intertwined his fingers with hers, a gesture of intimacy that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. "For the first time in a long time, I'm sure of something." They found William in the lobby of the building, surrounded by press aides and lawyers. His confident smile faltered slightly when he saw Alexander and Claire arriving together hand in hand. "Alexander," he greeted with false cordiality, "here to watch the show?" "I'm here to propose a truce," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "And to tell the real story, all of it." William dismissed his aides with a wave, his eyes fixed on the diary Alexander was carrying. "Where did you find that?" "In my mother's room. She kept the truth all these years, waiting for the right moment." For a moment, William's mask slipped, revealing the same wounded young man who had lost not only his best friend, but also the woman he loved. "You know, then, about her illness?" "I do," Alexander replied gently. "And I'm sorry, William, for all these years of anger and accusations. Isabella deserved more from both of us." Claire watched the interaction between the two men, sensing how decades of bitterness and misunderstandings began to dissolve under the weight of the truth. William stepped closer, his eyes now focused on Claire. "You're different from her," he said, surprising her. "Isabella let us fight over her, let us destroy each other, but you fought for the truth." "Because some things are more important than power or revenge," Claire replied, "like forgiveness and redemption." The main auditorium of Thompson Enterprises was packed when Alexander took the stage. Camera flashes went off incessantly as he stood behind the podium, Claire and William seated in the front row. "Today I'm not here as the CEO of Thompson Enterprises," Alexander began, his voice clear and strong. "I'm here as a man who spent years living a lie. A lie that cost friendships, destroyed trust, and tarnished the memory of someone very special." For an hour, Alexander told the story of Isabella, not the distorted version that had fueled his anger for years, but the truth revealed in his mother's diary. He spoke of love, illness, and sacrifice, of how fear and pride can turn misunderstandings into deep wounds. "William Carter is not my enemy," he declared, looking directly at his former friend. "He is a reminder of who I used to be, and an example of the man I no longer want to be." In the front row, William discreetly wiped away a tear. Claire gently squeezed his hand, a gesture of understanding and compassion. "And as for my marriage," Alexander continued, his eyes meeting Claire's, "what began as a business arrangement turned into the greatest lesson I've ever learned. Love is not a weakness, it's the greatest strength we can have." A murmur spread through the auditorium. Claire felt her heart race with Alexander's public declaration. This wasn't just a public relations strategy. There was truth in his words, a vulnerability he was finally unafraid to show. After the press conference in the gardens of the building, Alexander, Claire, and William found a moment of quiet. The sun had fully set, and the city lights cast a soft glow around them. "What happens now?" William asked, breaking the silence. "We start over," Alexander replied. "Thompson Enterprises has always been big enough for two families. The Carter's place on the board should never have been questioned." William nodded slowly. "And Isabella?" "We honor her memory by doing the right thing," Claire interjected, "establishing a foundation in her name for leukemia research and treatment, turning her story into something positive." The two men looked at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. It was such a simple, obvious solution that neither of them had considered during all those years of anger. "Claire is right," Alexander said, taking her hand. "It's time to use our power for something greater than ourselves." William watched the couple for a moment, a genuine smile finally appearing on his face. "You really love her, don't you? It's not like—" "No," Alexander gently interrupted. "It's different. It's real." Claire felt her heart swell with Alexander's words. What had started as a cold business arrangement had transformed into something deep and genuine, something even she hadn't expected. "The board will want an emergency meeting," William commented, shifting back into business mode. "We have a lot to reorganize." "And a lot to rebuild," Alexander agreed. "But this time, we'll do it right." As they walked back to the car, Claire noticed that the weight Alexander always seemed to carry on his shoulders had lightened. He was no longer the cold, calculating man who had proposed a marriage of convenience. He was someone who had finally found something more valuable than power and control. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing her contemplative gaze. Life has interesting ways of teaching us its lessons, she replied. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters. Alexander stopped, turning to face her completely. I didn't lose everything, Claire. Thanks to you, I found something I never knew I needed. And there, under the lights of New York, with the past finally at peace and the future full of possibilities, Claire realized that her upside-down fairy tale had transformed into something far more precious. A real story of love, forgiveness, and redemption. A year had passed since the press conference that changed everything. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of lonely power, now buzzed with a different energy. The gardens, always immaculate, had gained brighter colors with the changes Claire had suggested. The library, her favorite place, had been completely renovated, with cozy shelves filled with literary classics mixed in with business books. Claire walked through the main hallway, her steps echoing softly on the marble floor. She paused briefly in front of the restored portrait of the late Mrs. Thompson, now occupying a place of honor on the wall. Beside it, a photograph of Isabella had been placed, along with a discreet plaque for the newly inaugurated Isabella Thompson Foundation for Leukemia Research. The board just approved the new project, Alexander's voice sounded behind her. He approached, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. The foundation will fund a new research center at New York General Hospital. Claire smiled, turning to face him. The man before her was very different from the one who had proposed a marriage of convenience just over a year ago. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now carried a warmth she never tired of admiring. William called earlier, she commented. The first group of researchers has already been selected. Among them, a very promising young scientist who received the first Isabella Scholarship. Alexander nodded, a gentle smile on his lips. She would be proud, not just of the foundation, but of how we managed to turn all that pain into something positive. The sound of laughter from the garden caught their attention. Through the French window, they could see Marissa studying with her medical school classmates. She was in her second year of college, living her dream thanks to the change Claire's marriage had brought. But now, it was no longer a cold business arrangement that kept the family together. It was something much deeper. Sometimes I wonder, Claire said softly, if you knew this would happen when you proposed that deal to me. What? Falling hopelessly in love with the literature teacher who was supposed to be just part of a contract? Alexander laughed, pulling her closer. Believe me, that was my biggest fear at the time. Feelings weren't part of the plan. And now? Now I can't imagine my life without them, without you. Claire felt her heart race at the sincerity in his voice. It was amazing how fate had woven their story, turning a business deal into a journey of love and redemption. The intercom buzzed, announcing William's arrival. Since the reconciliation, he had become a constant presence in their lives, no longer as an antagonist, but as the friend he should have always been. Thompson Enterprises had grown stronger with the return of the Carters to the board, proving that some partnerships are destined to survive even the greatest storms. I brought the documents for the new pediatric wing, William announced as he entered, carrying a folder. His gaze softened as he saw Claire and Alexander together. It still surprises me to see you like this, old friend. Who would have thought the Iceman had a heart after all? Claire taught me that having a heart isn't a sign of weakness, Alexander replied, exchanging a knowing look with his wife. It's the source of the greatest strength we can have. Margaret appeared discreetly, announcing that lunch was served. The former housekeeper, who had guarded so many secrets over the years, now smiled more easily as if she too had been freed from an invisible weight. In the dining room, the large table that once seemed so cold and formal now accommodated a true family. Marissa joined them, still excited about her anatomy classes. William shared updates on the Foundation's progress. Claire and Alexander exchanged glances filled with understanding and love. I have an announcement to make, Claire said as dessert was served. All eyes turned to her, especially Alexander's. Actually, we have an announcement. Alexander took her hand across the table, his eyes shining with restrained emotion. They had discovered the news the previous week but had decided to wait for the right moment to share. We're pregnant, Claire announced, her voice overflowing with happiness. The reaction was immediate. Marissa jumped from her chair to hug her sister, tears of joy in her eyes. William raised his glass in a silent toast, his genuine smile revealing the true friendship that had been rebuilt. "A baby," Alexander murmured, still processing the news even after days. A new life, a fresh start. Claire squeezed his hand, understanding the weight of that moment. It wasn't just a baby coming. It was living proof that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that frozen hearts can melt, and that second chances exist for those brave enough to embrace them. Later in the garden, Claire found Alexander, watching the sunset, his silhouette outlined against the orange sky of New York. She approached quietly, fitting into his arms, as if that had always been her place. "You know I still have the contract," she commented, a playful smile on her lips. "The one you prepared for our initial agreement." Alexander laughed, a rich and genuine sound that still made her heart skip. "I think we can tear that up now. We have a much better deal." "Oh? And what would that be?" "Forever," he replied simply, leaning in to kiss her. "No clauses, no conditions, just love." Claire closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped by the moment. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, as if nature itself was celebrating their love story. A story that began with a cold business contract and transformed into something much deeper and truer. In her office, the old marriage contract rested in a drawer, now just a reminder of how fate works in mysterious ways. Beside it, Mrs. Thompson's diary remained as a silent witness that some truths need time to come to light, and that love, when genuine, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The future stretched out before them like a blank page, ready to be filled not with clauses and conditions, but with moments of love, understanding, and the joy of a family that found its way through the shadows into the light. It was the end of one story, but also the beginning of many others. Because love, when it finds its true home, never really ends. It simply transforms, grows, and blossoms in new and wonderful directions. Dear readers, we have journeyed together through the story of Claire and Alexander, a tale that shows us how true love has the power to transform even the coldest heart. If this narrative touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more moving stories like this one. Turn on the notification bell and leave your like. Every interaction helps us continue bringing content that moves and inspires. In the comments, tell us, do you believe a marriage of convenience can turn into true love? Share your thoughts and don't forget to let us know which city you're following us from. Until the next story.